Roger Waters went on Piers Morgan's show yesterday, favorite platform of uh, many anti-Semites, many people who call for the extermination of the Jews in one way or another. Of course, very few of them do it very explicitly, but I think Roger Waters came, as close as possible. It is not difficult to read into much of what he said, that this is what he would like to see happening. Welcome to the reality show. I'm joined by Kirk and Morgan. Guys, how's it going? Any opening comments before we go to the first clip? We're going to watch some of this. I'll say viewer discretion is advised, in a sense, because for me, this was difficult. We watched some difficult stuff, ahead of these shows, and this is in that category.
I have some comments. You say that Roger Waters, but I want to make sure I'm getting it says it in the title. He wants the Jews exterminated. Now, come on, come on. He just wants the millions of people in Israel to, just go to Eastern Europe or just leave the land. Is that really the same thing as wanting them exterminated?
Well, yeah, he wants them all to go specifically to where Jews were exterminated, which is interesting enough. Not all the Jews in Israel came from Poland and Germany, but we'll get to that when we get to that clip. Morgan, your opening thoughts. Um, I can't hear you, and Daniel also can't hear you. So
I cannot hear him either. He might be muted.
is that 2 seconds
Oh,
or 2 minutes? Because Um, you know what? Do you want us to go? We can go to the first clip, and you can include your opening comments in your comments on the first clip. Daniel, let's show the first clip from that show.
In the West Bank and what's happening in Gaza now, of course, as well.
Well, let me play you a clip. This is from a month ago. This was on your YouTube
It's not
channel.
George Galloway, is it?
No, it's from your own YouTube channel.
Okay.
It's called Resist the Genocide, and you said this.
When this is all over, Israel is going to have to apologize, not just to the Palestinians, but to the whole of the rest of the world. So we're very sorry. We got it all completely wrong, and we are now leaving. Okay, we'll go back to Eastern Europe or the United States or wherever we came from, and leave these people, the Palestinian people, people whose land this is, to, if they can, rebuild and live in peace.
Well, hang on, you didn't play the rest of it.
Okay.
Where it said,
Well, let's pause here and then talk about what he says in the rest of it. I was naive enough to think when I saw the beginning of that he's gonna say something like Israel should apologize for, the genocide in Gaza, which of course he is a line that he repeats often on this show and elsewhere, which of course is bullshit in and of itself. But no, he wants Israel to apologize for its very existence, to apologize for the fact that there is one sliver of land in the cesspool that is the Middle East, that is not barbaric and savage, and that respects rights to some extent. And I guess the worst part is allows Jews to live. And he wants them to go back specifically to the place where they were exterminated. Now, interesting and conspicuous in its absence there is the any mention of if Jews are going to go back to where they came from. He's not mentioning the many Arab countries that hundreds of thousands of Jews came from, and millions are now the descendants of those who came from there. I guess they would also be occupiers there because maybe they'll bring some level of civilization there. But no, he was very specific in where he wants the Jews to go. Morgan.
I'm sorry about the tech issue there. I wondered why you guys weren't roaring with laughter at the jokes I was cracking before we went live, but now I know. My initial comment was just going to be that I'm sorry to any fans of Pink Floyd, although maybe those people might be more aware of Roger Waters' history. in terms of his political views. I'm a bit more of a casual fan of Pink Floyd, and so wasn't aware just of how dreadful he is. And having watched this interview, which goes on for an hour, where he pours out just some of the most awful, bileful, disgusting opinions, as some of which we've just seen, it's making listening to Pink Floyd a bit harder for me in the future, I think. And I think one of the things that should strike people, hearing him say, oh, we, the Israelis, we're going to go back to where we came from. We're going to go back to Eastern Europe and wherever else he mentions. I think that should strike people as sounding an awful lot like a sentiment that's coming from the right, the racist right in a lot of countries. People who don't want the kind of, the outsiders, whoever, to be in their country, and who are xenophobes in some sense. And one of the things that we're very bad at doing is recognizing racism, and particularly anti-Semitism, when it comes from the left. We're very good and adept, typically, I would think, at spotting it when it comes from the right. But when it's coming from someone who's coming from a left-wing perspective, suddenly it becomes quite difficult for us as a culture to recognize that and to label it as such. And I think if you're watching Roger Waters here, the kind of weird circumlocutions he goes through in his reasoning, the kind of evasions he has to make, I think people should look at this and should see, this is what a kind of racism and anti-Semitism looks like when it's coming from someone from a radical left background. And we need to be able to pick that up much quicker than we normally do.
Yeah, some people in the chat mentioned that, Roger Waters has been obsessed with Israel for a long time. Clementine mentions that whenever an artist canceled their performance in Israel, we're like, oh, it's Roger Waters and BDS again. Yeah, that's been his issue for a long time, but it's I think it's something that people who are from Israel or follow closely what goes on will unfortunately know that. Kirk.
Yeah, I think Morgan is absolutely correct when, you often hear the blood and soil nonsense and insanity when it comes from the racist elements on the right, but you often see it from the left, especially when it comes to Israel. I've noticed for years, here in the United States, you get the blood and soil nonsense when it comes to the anti-immigration mentality, but then you kind of get it in the anti-gentrification movements in big cities throughout the United States. So, you definitely see it here with Israel, and you see it here with Roger Waters. Like, just go to Eastern Europe or the United States. Like, as Razi mentioned, that's where the Holocaust happened. And even after World War II, Eastern Europe fell behind the Iron Curtain, was under communist rule. Like, that was much better. And then even after the Cold War, now what? We have a war in Ukraine, which, interestingly enough, if you watch enough of this interview, Roger Waters has a lot of hot takes. He likes to throw around the G word when describing what Israel does foreign policy wise, and loves to give Hamas this big benefit of the doubt and whatnot. Yet when they get to the Putin and Ukraine issue, he doesn't want to condemn Putin, doesn't want to say he's a war criminal, says, well, that's for international war experts or whatever to discuss, I guess. But another point, I want to read this excerpt from an essay, if you guys will excuse me. Observe the nature of today's alleged peace movements, professing loving concern for the survival of mankind. They keep screaming that the nuclear weapons race should be stopped, that armed forces should be abolished as a means of settling disputes among nations, and that war should be outlawed in the name of humanity. Yet these same peace movements do not oppose dictatorships. The political views of their members range through all shades of the statist spectrum, from welfare statism to socialism to fascism to communism. This means that they are opposed to the use of coercion by one nation against another, but not by the government of a nation against its own citizens. It means that they are opposed to use of force against armed adversaries, but not against the disarmed. And I think this is from Ayn Rand's essay, Roots of War, which she wrote in 1966. And I think you're seeing this mentality with Roger Waters here. He's talking a big game about peace and how, the Israel should just move out of Israel. We know what's going to happen if that were to ever happen. One, as if that's a realistic scenario, realistic expectation to expect millions of people in Israel to just leave and go to Eastern Europe and the United States, as if both those regions are not already having big, as if immigration is already not a hot button issue in those regions of the world. But even if that were to happen, we know that Hamas would likely fill that void, and then they would impose an Islamic theocracy on whoever is left. And I imagine, Roger Waters can pat himself on the back for being such a peacenik and peace-loving guy as he helps usher Hamas into power in a region of the world that, Razi, what did you describe the Middle East as earlier?
Cesspool.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, by the way, Roger Waters speaks with incredible clarity when he's talking about how evil Israel is in everything that it does. And that's the only thing he speaks with clarity on. So yeah, he struggles when he's asked about Putin. He struggles when he's asked about Hamas. We're gonna get, unfortunately, to the part where he's asked about October 7th. And yeah, he at some point there was a mention there that he's the same age as Biden, but much more sharp mentally, which is true. But it definitely seemed like a Biden moment there, and I don't think it was an age issue. I think it was a morality issue, let's say. Let's Morgan, did you want to add something before we continue to actually? Yeah.
No. Let's go on.
Yeah, we'll show just what he said after that, because he said to Piers Morgan that he didn't show the whole clip, and he explains, after he says, let's, commit ethnic cleansing against the Jews in Israel, he I guess waters it down, if you will, in his view. Let's watch that part.
Well, hang on, you didn't play the rest of it.
Okay.
But it said, of course, any of you want to stay will be welcome to stay as citizens of this new state.
But the state, to be clear, would be Palestine.
Well, my personal opinion is that would be what it should be called. It was called Palestine up to 1948, and it could. But hang on a minute, that's an open discussion.
Well, I haven't asked a question yet.
Excuse me, stop interrupting me. I heard somebody suggest the other day it could be called the Holy Land.
All right. Actually, this is not important, because the important part is he said the Jews can stay, which is very generous. What the country is going to be called is non-essential, but. The Jews can stay in the country run by the people who did October 7th means that on October 7th, when they did what they did, they had to fight their way through a wall, through a fence. They had to. It was a struggle killing Jews. It would not be a struggle to kill Jews if there was no fence, there was no barrier, there's nothing. There are no Israeli defense forces. There's nobody defending the Jews from extermination. Kind of like what the situation was in the place that Roger Waters wants the Jews to go back to. Morgan.
And I mean, it's a bizarre thing. I think the reason why he has to tack that onto the end there and say, oh, but wait, you'd be welcome to stay here if you'd want to, is because it's probably too harsh for him to really admit to himself the awful reality of what he's just said. I was saying before how this should be reminiscent to people of views from the radical right, the racist right, however you want to put it. I think admitting to himself that that's really the kind of position that he holds would be difficult. And so he has to say, oh, but you could stay if you wanted to, maybe. Except you wouldn't actually advocate the kind of view that he's just said if you really didn't have a problem with the Jews or the Israelis, whoever, actually being there. And so I think this is just a kind of smokescreen so that he can feel a bit better about the position he's just advocated. And as we'll see in some of the later clips, the kind of language he ends up using is much more racialized, much more xenophobic, of that kind of thing. But I'll wait till we get to that bit.
Yeah, by the way, I think the first time, actually before the clip we showed, was the first time he said something like they wouldn't let me, the they part, and then he said the Israel lobby. The Israel lobby is, of course, the creation of the state of Israel, made expressing anti-Semitic views while calling it not anti-Semitism much easier for these people. Kirk.
Yeah, when talking about October 7th, I noticed that I don't know if we're going to get into all of it, but he's all over the place. Like, on one hand, he is skeptical about some of the claims. Conveniently enough, he's skeptical about some of the horrific stories that came out about October 7th. On the other hand, he wants to blame Israel for October 7th. He says, Hamas doesn't have any helicopters, and how were they able to get over there? And Pierce has to constantly remind him, like, yeah, there's really no denying this. Hamas fighters, they videotape themselves going into these music festivals, so you can't really hide behind this. So it sounds like he wants it both ways, but I don't even know what his exact views are on October 7th. And I think another point Pierce brought up was, yeah, for someone who has such strong opinions on this conflict, you seem to take about a week to really post anything in public about what your thoughts were on October 7th. You were promoting your album, but didn't have much to say about this. But then Roger Waters says, oh, well, I was waiting for more information so I can have an educated opinion, apparently.
Yeah, we will. I think we'll get to that part. But in any way, yeah. In any case, he did struggle when it came to talking about October 7th, and part of the struggle there is he wants to be able to get away with the things he's trying to get away with, like talking about this is a human rights issue and so on. Thank you, PC, for the super chat. PC says Waters is like Galloway. I don't know if this is a compliment or an insult to either of them, but in a sense, yes, they are certainly in the sense of what I wish for both of them. Let's go to the next clip. Daniel, all right, there it is.
And to accept that the most important thing that we're all fighting for at the moment is around Gaza and around the extermination of the people of Palestine, because what we're fighting for is the soul of the human race. We're fighting to try and achieve a future where we understand that things like right and wrong exist, and we have to stand up for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And excuse, no, not yet. Andrew Feinstein will, and Keir Starmer won't. We know Keir Starmer's a bald man. I wouldn't believe him, well, we know Keir Starmer. We've known.
Well, George Galloway last week told me he would trust Vladimir Putin over Keir Starmer. Would you?
Did he? Well, obviously, you only have to listen to what the two men say.
You would believe Putin over Starmer?
Why not? But why would they be having a conversation about anything apart from let's make Ukraine into a NATO country, which... Well,
we'll come to Ukraine. Can I just pick you up on one thing you said? We have to have a conversation.
I haven't finished about Andrew Feinstein. Excuse me. So that's deeply important. There are others. There are two young women who I interviewed a couple of days ago, and they're up. Double Down News, man. Go check it. All
right. So... Yeah, I'm trying to remember why I wanted why I chose that clip, but a part of it is he was asked, this is before what we saw, he was asked by Piers Morgan, why are you here? Why are you doing this interview? And he said it's because of the election. And his point about the election is, of course, that the Labour Party that has said they would recognize the state of Palestine and didn't say it's as a reward for October 7th, but I don't know how else to interpret that. They're not pro-Hamas enough. They're not clear enough on supporting the extermination of the Jews, which is something that Palestinians are not, it's not a controversial topic there, and it's not something that they hide. It's not a view that they hide. They don't hide behind, oh, we're against Israel. They say Jews. They don't say Israel or Israelis. And it's so he's there to support those people. And what's interesting to me there is also that he said this is the most important issue. Yesterday, those of you who missed the Daily Objective, that the title of that was what is it, the most important issue of our lifetime or something to that effect. And yeah, we agree on that, and we're clearly on two sides of the divide, as I'm sure we would have been in World War II and other instances where it's, I think, very, very clear what is right and what is wrong.
I think it's strange how people who are kind of crackpottish and minded towards conspiracy theories and that kind of mindset, who are then also minded towards anti-Semitism as well, we should say, seem to be almost uniformly on the kind of Russian side of the Russia-Ukrainian war. There's something strange about that, but at the same time, there seems to be something that makes sense. I mean, I think the real kind of notable bit of that is the fact that he says he would trust Putin over Keir Starmer any day. And that is just a bizarre comment to make. For all the fact that I dread that tomorrow Keir Starmer is going to become the leader of my country, I think he's going to do a lot of immoral things. There is a tremendous difference between Keir Starmer and Vladimir Putin. One is a blood-soaked dictator who is driving a country which, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, could have had a potentially good future. He's going to drive that potentially good future into the ground. And Keir Starmer is someone who is misguided and immoral, but is fundamentally a kind of Western-style leader who's bound by the rule of law, who is misguided on many things and is immoral on many things, but who I would trust, not to kill me, but I wouldn't trust Vladimir Putin to do anything like that. And I think people who end up supporting these kind of things, when they're supporting such immoral causes as the Palestinian cause in the way that Roger Waters is, I think there's something about, they have to try and deny that there is any difference between someone who's more fundamentally good, as loath as I am to say that about Keir Starmer, and someone who is just absolutely evil. They have to try and blur those distinctions. I think that must be why they come to this kind of opinion. But even so, I find it hard to understand.
Yeah, although there is a certain consistency to supporting the Palestinians and supporting Putin. I mean, there's a great consistency. PC, correct you, Morgan. Keir Starmer will be prime minister on Friday, not tomorrow. We still have a day and a half to enjoy living under Rishi Sunak's leadership. Kirk.
One thing I found interesting about this interview is that Roger Waters seems to understand the power and importance of words and concepts. Like I mentioned earlier, he likes to throw around the G word when describing Israel and their willingness to fight back. And then at the same time, he was asked at one point if he thinks that what Hamas did on October 7th was a terrorist attack. And Roger Waters was like, oh, I don't know if I want to use that kind of language, getting all weaselly. At the same time, he described, I think someone pointed out earlier that Roger Waters views October 7th as armed resistance. He definitely lumps in Hamas with Palestinian liberation. And if you're talking about Hamas, liberation from what exactly? So yeah, he does seem to understand the importance of concepts, and yeah, I don't know what else to add to that. He seems to at least know what he's talking about, and he's very careful with his words. And yeah, he'll use the worst language to describe Israel. Won't use that same language about Hamas or Putin. Evades what Hamas is ultimately about, and that's Roger Waters for you.
Well, some more Roger Waters for you. Daniel, let's play the next clip.
Other people who live there. And I have to say, the thing about Eastern Europe or Northeastern Europe and the United States, they've tried to sell us this idea that somehow they are biblical people and that God has given them the land. That's what the Christian evangelicals believe.
Well, look,
All I'm saying is that they're not indigenous people, most of them. There are a few of the Jewish people who are citizens of Israel who are indigenous to the area. But back in the 19th century, that was only 7 or 8% of the population.
Can I respond?
Yes, of course.
So ancient Egyptian records mention Israel from 1213 BC. Religious literature
Should we pause here? Morgan, this is your clip, so I don't know if you wanted to play more.
Well, Piers Morgan goes on for about a minute talking about records of Jewish people being in the Middle East 1,000 years. That's not particularly relevant, but the only bit there's a bit once Roger Waters starts speaking again. But we can stop here and talk about this bit.
All right, go ahead. Unless you want to, if you want to play that, we can. Or
well, I think it should. Again, this is the bit that people should find really shocking. The idea that he cares who is indigenous, whatever that really means, to the area, as if that has any import or weight. That should be really shocking to people. And it should be, if that comes up in any other field, if in the field of domestic politics in whatever country you're living in, if someone gets, obsessed about who is indigenous and who is not, and we should treat the indigenous differently to the non-indigenous, that should be a sign to you, I think, of someone with a bit of a sick, diseased and dying mind. And there's a way in which obsession with the Jews, I always think, is a sign of that exact thing. And it's unfortunately common in discussions around Israel. I mean, it makes sense in the sense that unfortunately, even a lot of the pro-Israel people will talk about this being our homeland, and that's a problem. But this should stand out to people as this is a guy who seems racist, really. His obsession with who was born here and who wasn't, and in the 19th century it was 7 or 8%. The implication being, I guess, that if 7 or 8%, the percentage was 7 or 8%, then okay, that's fine. Those people can stay. It's a bizarre, strange argument and strange point of view, but which there's a whole literature in the discussion of the conflict about kind of this kind of thing, and it's something which the whole world and the people who want to see the good triumph in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict would all benefit from seeing that talking point, that line of thought going away.
PC mentioned yesterday in a super chat on the Daily Objective, he said something to the effect of the Nazis were left wing, and I was making the point that it's very, this is one of the many problems with the left-right political spectrum. If you have Basically, if you have Nazis on one side and communists on the other, what does that say about the spectrum? What's like, is there a middle ground, and is that ideal, or what? It's a problematic spectrum, but you see the similarities because the supposedly the further you go left or right, you get more collectivism. You really see the similarities when it comes to Israel, when it comes to Jews. We've seen this here with Nick Griffin, the leader of the British National Party, endorsing George Galloway because George Galloway understands the problem is the Jews, not the words Nick Griffin used, but certainly what he was thinking. We saw this and we talked about this. Was it last week with Nick Fuentes and AOC having their Twitter flirting going on over there, and so we see a lot of this, and it makes sense because yeah, these sides, you are hearing Roger Waters using the language that you hear from white supremacists when it comes to this country, and it would be interesting to ask him if he thinks that black people should go back to Africa because they're not the indigenous people of England. I don't know. I didn't see Piers Morgan ask him that question, but I would love to hear him try to answer that.
Just if I can just add on to that, another context where on the left, this kind of idea of the indigenous and this kind of thing comes up. And I think there's quite a few, but one of them that's notable to me is in the context of the United States talking about Native Americans. I remember being at a Thanksgiving Day dinner full of people who were kind of on the left, and that this issue of Native Americans and their right to the land in the US came up. And someone showed me a picture of a young girl at a protest holding a sign. I guess she was of Native American heritage, and she was holding up a sign saying, "This was our land before it was yours. Go back to Europe." Now, that's a tremendously racist sentiment. The poor girl obviously has just been given the sign. She doesn't really know. It's not really her fault. But, association with, Native Americans have a right to the land. It's theirs, and people in America are just squatting on it or colonizing it or whatever. That's a cause which is associated with the left. And you do again see that kind of racist language and sentiment coming up. It just happens to be for the group which they prefer, as opposed to white Europeans. And I agree, Razi, that the debate over whether it's really right and left is not consequential, that the more fundamental thing is the kind of racial collectivism there. The only sense in which I think it's right to point out that this is coming from the left is just that people seem to believe that the left can never be guilty of this kind of thing. And yet actually this is the kind of language that's coming up in their discourses all the time.
Yeah, and we have a comment in the chat from Nobody, that's the username, saying that human race is indigenous to planet Earth. Yeah, that's true. And again, by the way, we have at some point soon an episode on the whole idea of indigenous people. We will have an objectivist philosopher for that, so tune in for that. Kirk.
Yeah, like we were talking about earlier, it sounds more like the same blood and soil nonsense this time coming from the loony leftist types. And reminds me of, I remember during the early Trump years when he was talking about building a wall, I would see, liberals post this meme like, yeah, if you're going to build the wall, you should build it here. And it's like the border of like California and Texas, New Mexico and Arizona, all the land that used to belong to Mexico. And I'm like, yeah, great. Yeah, we're just going to hand California and New Mexico over to Mexico, which also has like horrible abortion restrictions. Is that what you guys really want? I think Mexico has since changed its abortion laws, but at the time I'm like, this isn't the gotcha you guys think it is. But yeah, going back to what you said earlier, I don't know if it's just me, maybe I'm too Americanized, but like my ancestors came from different various parts of Europe, Italy, Ireland, Hungary, England. They all came to America, happened to procreate with one another, then their kids procreated with one another. Eventually I came into existence, but the point I'm trying to get at is that I don't really think of like America as like a homeland. Like I have like some sort of like bizarre ties to this land because my ancestors came from various different parts of the world. I don't know if I can really tie my lineage or ancestry to like one particular part of land, especially when we're talking about countries that I myself have never been to, whose languages I've never spoke, and all that fun stuff.
I remember when Rucka was a host on the Daily Objective, he mentioned this commercial on television in the US. I've never seen it for 23andMe, and like the tagline was something like "Find out who you really are," which is really a terrifying slogan. If this is and this is a commercial they want to sell, so they clearly think this is this is something that's going to sell, and apparently I don't know if it was if it faced much opposition outside of this channel, but yeah, these views are widespread, and in some places you're allowed, and on some issues you're allowed to express them, on others not. Certainly when it comes to telling the Jews to go back to where they came from, especially if you mean the gas chambers, then yeah, that is acceptable apparently. All right, let's play some more of Roger Waters.
Attacks occurred. George Galloway was here last week, and he described them as terror attacks. Do you agree with that?
I'm not going to have this conversation. I've seen you have it with everybody, and you're. It's a waste of time.
Why?
Because you always reach the same conclusions, and you always waste 10 or 12 minutes.
Let's waste 1 minute. All I ever ask people is, do you condemn what Hamas did?
I condemn the killing of civilians, always, whoever does it, wherever it is. I condemn war crimes. If Hamas committed war crimes on October the 7th, I condemn. You referred earlier. Excuse me. You referred earlier to my conversation with Glenn Greenwald,
yes,
which happened in December last year, and I was taken to task after that because on his program, and this was only a few weeks after October the 7th, I said I would love to know what happened on October.
All right, let's pause it here. We have, I think, Daniel, it's more than 3 minutes. I think it was like 5 minutes of content that I would like us to comment on if we can. A side note is that Roger Waters complains throughout this interview all the time about Piers Morgan interrupting him, even though he interrupts Piers Morgan as well. And by the way, Piers Morgan interrupts a lot, and he didn't do it as much as he usually does, but yeah, we'll get to an interesting way in which he expressed his issue with that later on. Yeah, if this is where he's not sure about the facts. He's sure that Israel is committing genocide. At some point, he said that something like Israel wants to kill all the people in Gaza, but he's not sure what happened on October 7th. Now, and a part of what he's claiming, and this may be later on, is that Israel doesn't let others investigate it. But what happened? What we know about what happened on October 7th, and the first information we got was while it was happening, and it was from Hamas, because Hamas, as we know, live streamed themselves because they know there are people like Roger Waters around the world who would admire them for murdering Jews, for doing it in the most horrific ways possible, torturing, raping, burning people alive. So that is all out there. I've said in the past on shows that many pro-Palestinian, so-called pro-Palestinian people probably have never spoken to a Palestinian and clearly don't know what the Palestinians want. I don't think that's the case with Roger Waters. I think he has spoken to Palestinians. He knows what they want, and he sees himself as sort of a middleman, telling people in the West a different story about who the Palestinians are. So the the ultimate agenda, the final solution, if you will become more more acceptable. Morgan.
Just before I comment on this, I just wanted to say again on the racism point that Rand has an essay on racism, which we all attended a talk about just in the last few weeks. And she makes a comment in there I'd forgotten about the kind of petty racism of people who are focused too much on their lineage. And I think that essay is very useful and clarifying for people, not only just understanding racism generally, but is very useful in the context of the conflict here. So I think it's useful to focus on. And there's a way in which I think 23andMe comes up into that, but I'll put that aside. So then I think what you see Roger Waters starting to do here, and as we play the clip more, you'll see it come up more and more when he's talking about October 7th, is that when people want to deny that something happened, but kind of know that they shouldn't, they adopt a very different standard of evidence before they can be convinced that something has happened. So when it comes to, Israelis killing however many people, he mentions the Hamas death toll figure of 40,000 people in the current war, for example. He's very easily convinced of that, even though that's coming from a very unreliable source, as we've done videos on. It shouldn't really be considered an objective statistic at all. However, when it comes to even just the mere fact of people being killed on October 7th, it takes a lot of effort to convince him that that's even happened. And eventually Piers Morgan gets him to kind of concede that it's happened, although even then he's very much hedging and very much wants to say that actually some of this was legitimate. And so when people want to deny and something like this has gone on, it's not usually, people won't usually just outright deny it. They'll adopt this very high standard of evidence before they'll be convinced. And that's a way of just adopting a kind of skepticism so they don't just have to come out and say it. I think people should notice that a lot amongst people who are in these kind of tribal mindsets where they're hardcore on one side and they don't want to concede anything. They suddenly become, David Hume style skeptics about being convinced of anything.
Yeah, there's a point where he says, I don't think we'll get to that point, but where he says 100,000 people are buried under the rubble, and then he changes it to 40,000. Now, of course, that's not even what Hamas is saying, and we know that Hamas comes up with things on the fly. But they're not saying 40,000 are buried under the rubble. But that's something I mentioned on this show or on the Daily Objective, this shouting match I had with a Palestinian here in London in January, and part of that, at some point, he shouts 20,000 people have been killed, and then I think less than a minute later, 40,000 people have been killed, and sometimes you don't remember the exact number, but sometimes you are making it up or repeating what you know is made up, and then you can kind of then you can count 20,000 bodies in a minute and revise the figures. Kirk, before I go to you, just thank you, Frank, for the super chat. Frank says, Roger Waters tells Jews, there is no pain you are receiving. Thank you, Jonathan, for the super chat. Jonathan says, Waters... Siri was interested in that. Jonathan said, hang on. I'll read Jonathan's super chat in a second because Siri is very interested in this show. Kirk, I will go to you.
So many convenient nicknames we can have for Roger Waters. Roger Waters down October 7th. Roger Waters down Hamas atrocities. Going back to the whole talk about like indigenous people, indigenous lands. Now I'm starting to wonder if this is why he's kind of pro-Putin, or at least soft on Putin, because in that part of Putin's perspective is that, hey, Ukraine and its people belong to motherland Russia, and the reason why it's its own country is because of Western imperial interests at play that took Ukraine from the motherland. Maybe that's why Roger Waters is sympathetic to Mr. Putin.
Yeah, Morgan.
Well, I was going to say, I think it's interesting that Piers Morgan doesn't really pick him up on the indigenous point. Now, partly it's because he's going to come back with the kind of pro-Israeli version of that, oh, the Jews have been indigenous for so long. But I think the idea of just talking about indigenous people should strike people as kind of offensive or kind of alarming as when people are talking about blood or ethnicity. Like Roger Waters might as well be saying, these people don't have the right blood to be here. They're not the right ethnicity to be here, because it really is amounting to the same thing. And the fact that we seem to give a pass to the idea of an indigenous people, because there's some kind of, Rousseauian noble thing to an indigenous people going on in the background. There's a real problem and inconsistency there. And if I'm not trying to give Piers Morgan any credit, but if he was someone better, he should hear Roger Waters talking about indigenous people, and it should really start ringing alarm bells in his mind. And yet clearly it doesn't, and it's a real problem.
Yeah. So Jonathan, thanks again. Jonathan says Waters is a lunatic and Pink Floyd is crap. I'm not sure how many people would agree with the second point there, but Jonathan also said later on, if you're sober, it absolutely sucks. I don't know, but all right, we'll take your word for it. Yeah, all right, let's go to the next clip.
Have a proper go. Well, the Israelis won't allow
We suggested
any
it might be
investigation.
he suggested it might be a false flag operation.
Well,
implying that Israel created
it. Hang on, maybe false flag's not exactly the right word, but why did
Well, it's
they?
obviously not the
Hang
right
on,
word.
can I finish?
Yeah, but you're wrong,
All right, never mind.
Roger. It obviously wasn't a false flag. And the reason we know that is that Hamas broadcast in real time through video to social media what they were doing. There's nothing false flag about it.
I'm not saying that part of the Palestinian resistance movement didn't cross that wire fence into what's called
2,000 of them did.
Hang on, or 2,000, however many, it doesn't really matter how many it was. I'm not saying they didn't do that. I'm not saying that didn't happen at all. What I'm saying is, there's all this talk about, does Israel have a right to defend itself? Why didn't Israel defend itself that morning? Why did they wait 7 hours before they started machine gunning?
Well, it was a catastrophic
everyone?
failure of defence and security.
And this is the most efficient security.
Yeah, it was catastrophic. That's why when this is over,
all right, you don't want to have that conversation. Neither do I. But wouldn't it?
All right, neither do I. But let's pause it here and have it anyway. So
he's just asking questions, Razi. He's just asking questions. Isn't that the bedrock science? Is asking questions and then proving it or whatever?
Yeah, maybe false flag is not exactly the right way to put it. He said at some point. And then he asks that question. Now, there's something weird about asking that question. First of all, you are accusing Israel of intentionally allowing its civilians and its soldiers to be slaughtered by Palestinians for hours before preventing it. But if that were true, how does that make supporting the Palestinians who did the slaughtering the right thing to do? I mean, there are questions that come up when you hear these people like Roger Waters ask questions. Morgan.
The idea of false flag operations is, again, it's one of these anti-Semitic tropes which comes up a lot around Israel that there's a real obsession with. Again, if people go read Dave Rich's book about anti-Semitism, he has a chapter where he's talking about people like Jeremy Corbyn who are complaining about Israel and false flag operations. And it goes back really to the kind of idea that the Jews are secretly controlling things, manipulating things behind the scenes in order to deceive you. I mean, if you think about, again, with 9/11, although the suggestion of a false flag operation is really saying that the Bush government was conducting a false flag in order to invade the Middle East. The suggestion as well is that none of the Jews showed up to work on 9/11 and all this kind of stuff. So when you hear anyone talking about a false flag operation around Israel, it should really, again, twig to you. This is someone who's really conspiratorially minded, who doesn't have any evidence for what they're saying. They're engaging in just arbitrary questioning, which is kind of what he'll go on to do here. He'll say, but how did they end up failing like this? And the suggestion is, prove me wrong, or just the suggestion is enough to be convincing. And so again, when I'm saying that he has this kind of sick, diseased mind, it's that he's also engaging here, that perhaps not obviously to some people, in this kind of conspiratorial kind of minded thing.
Yeah. PC says no Jews turned up to work is a lie. Of course it's a lie. And it's not. And the thing is, these are not things that are then checked by the people. You hear that somewhere. And we've said this about a lot of things. I mentioned yesterday, I'll mention again. Maybe I should check this because it's been about a month or so since last I checked. But the Jeremy Corbyn had, since October until about a month ago, last time I checked, on his Twitter that Israel bombed El Ali hospital and killed 500 people. They don't care. People like that do not actually care if, care to check whether or not their facts are correct. If they find out that they're not, they will still keep saying what they're saying because it puts the ideas that they want to put into people's heads. Kirk.
Yeah, and I think it's important to highlight. Notice what he's doing and what he did throughout this whole interview. He uses strong moral language to condemn Israel, saying that they're doing a genocide and violating all these human rights or whatever. Yet when it comes to talk about October 7th, he's, just asking questions saying, yeah, where was Israel's security? Suggesting that Israel may have let this happen. Yet at the same time, he talks about Hamas. He described them in that clip as Palestinian resistance movement. Earlier, when he was asked to condemn the atrocities of Hamas, instead of condemning Hamas, he just put out a blanket statement saying, well, I don't like any killing of civilians. He won't use any moral language to condemn Hamas or even Putin, as we can see, but he will Israel. I think that tells you a lot about Mr. Roger Waters down October 7th over here.
All right, let's continue the clip.
Wouldn't it be great to have that conversation at some? And wouldn't it be great if we could have an actual real investigation beyond the very good Al Jazeera documentary that we all saw that came out, and all the great work that the Grey Zone and Electronic Intifada people did in debunking all the filthy, disgusting lies that the Israelis told after October the 7th.
Like what?
About burning babies and women being raped, which were all completely...
Actually, women were raped.
No, they weren't.
Yes, they were.
Well, there's no evidence.
It's been established by the
You
United
can
Nations.
say anything that you want, but there's no evidence.
But actually, there is extensive evidence.
There is no
of sexual
evidence.
assault and rape. Well, there is.
Okay, well, all right, now.
Also, we know what Hamas broadcast on social media.
Calm down. Roger, calm down. Don't sink to his level. All right, I won't.
What level?
Well, stop shouting. Stop shouting back. Let him interrupt you as much as you want. Okay, all right. Sorry, Piers, what were you saying?
All right.
Wrong.
So, okay, there's maybe those should have been divided into two. There's two different things there. A part where he's talking to himself, let's leave that for a second. Excellent Al Jazeera documentary. Yeah, of course, it's not a surprise. A terrorist attack like October 7th is not a cheap thing to do. It costs money. Running a news network is also not a cheap thing to do. Costs money. The money comes from the same source, certainly in many of the cases. So yeah, excellent documentary by the people who also funded and host the leaders of those who committed the atrocities on October 7th. Of course, they will make a documentary. We don't know if the planning for that documentary started before October 7th. I don't know, but yeah, it's not a surprise that is the source that he trusts, and he thinks, of course, everything that he that doesn't fit with his narrative is Israeli propaganda, rather than, again, as we mentioned, Hamas propaganda. I just wanted to also say about before that, about the false flag thing. It's interesting that, after 9/11, when they said it's a false flag, they said it's in order to take the oil. That never happened. Then with Gaza, they said, it's in order to commit genocide, and of course that's not happening, and the exact opposite is happening. Israel is feeding its enemy, and if there's any support for genocide on Israel's part, it's support, unfortunately, for the Palestinians who are attempting to commit a genocide against the Jews. That's the extent to which you can accuse Israel of any complicity in genocide. It's the humanitarian aid given to the Palestinians and the lack of proper military action against them. Morgan.
Well, just on him talking to himself, again, I think it's a sign that he's become a bit old and a bit crazy, but also, it seems to be something a bit odd in his personality. As for what he's saying before that, as I was saying before, he stresses how much reading he's done about the conflict and how educated and informed he is. Now, whether he actually is or not, I don't know. but the kind of things which he could have been reading, which would lead him to this kind of point of view. As I say, there's a tremendous literature about this. And if you were to solely isolate yourself to just reading something from that point of view, unfortunately, you could come away with something like this kind of opinion. And it isn't just an opinion on the kind of freak fringe, it's awfully mainstream. If I go to any of the bookshops around me and I look at the kind of history section concerning Israel and Palestine, a lot of the books which would lead one to that point of view are on the shelves, and there's a lot of them. And unfortunately, I think this is the point of view which has the momentum in the discussion around the conflict, the pro-Israeli perspective, or the kind of perspective we're trying to put forward, that Israel is a free and rights-respecting nation. It just doesn't have any of the momentum at all. And it's, even someone like Joe Biden, who is trying to walk a kind of middle line where he's, rhetorically condemning Israel, but, trying to give some support at the same time. The people who are really causing him to hedge are this kind of, radicals who are advocating for the kind of point of view that Roger Waters is putting across. And that is why we're seeing such awful opinions popping up in the culture, because it's these people who have the kind of moral core of the discussion. And we really dearly need to change that.
I do think you're letting him off the hook a little bit there. I mean, look, if you do a lot of reading, and the reading you do is an electronic intifada, and you watch documentaries, and they're Al Jazeera documentaries, you want the viewpoint that you already hold to have some backing with facts, so to speak, rather than you want to actually get to the truth of the matter. So, and later on, I think maybe in the next clip or the one after that, we'll see some of the specifics that he seems to not know, or at least pretend not to know. And if he's just getting his news from Al Jazeera, it's possible that he doesn't know that stuff. But again, that's entirely on him.
Yeah, and I'll just say, for anyone who hasn't seen the Al Jazeera documentary he's talking about, we did do a podcast about that, which maybe we can link in the description. But also he's talking about the electronic intifada, as you say, which is just an awful website. And I wouldn't suggest people go read any of their publications without a strong stomach. But even just, I try and read people from this point of view sometimes, just to get a view of it. And I was reading a book called The 100 Years' War on Palestine, and the whole first chapter of it, so it's broken up into the different wars on Palestine. And of course, it's referring to the 1948 war, the 1967 war, and so on. But the first section, which is the first war in Palestine, is something like 1900 to 1948, during which time what it's talking about is Jewish immigration into the area. That is considered by these people as a war or an attack on the region. And even just some of those things, if you accept those kind of tacit premises which are slipped in, then you're going to come out with a really warped and awful perspective like Roger Waters. Now, I agree, I don't want to let him off the hook, because a lot of this is being supplied by him as well. But my point is just that some of the really awful things he's saying have an awfully mainstream kind of tone to them from a lot of these books.
Yeah, Kirk.
So people describe the immigration into Palestine from 1900 to 1948. They conflated that with war and invasion. Where have we heard this conflation of immigration with stuff like invasion before?
From racist
Kind
right-wing
of getting back to what we said to earlier, like the blood and soil left, blood and soil right. We're seeing a lot of similarities between the two these days.
Thank you, Crusader General, for the super chat. Crusader General says this degenerate did to his music what De Niro did to his movies. And Crusader General, thank you for another super chat. He says Palestinians, aka Hamas, are only the symptom of cancer, with the C being the crescent of Islam. Yes, although again, when you look at how people in some cases follow Islam consistently, you end up with Hamas, with Al-Qaeda, with ISIS, and so on. And of course, there are Muslims who are not consistent followers of Islam, which is better, much better, let's say. Not as good as if they were rational people, but it's maybe a step in the right direction. Let's play the next clip.
Sorry, Piers, what were you saying?
Look, let's not prolong the discussion about whether you believe what happened on October the 7th, other than me just to simply ask you.
Wouldn't it be nice to be able to look at all the evidence and come to a grown-up conclusion rather than just saying this happened or that happened or this didn't?
Well, it's now been established that 1,200 people were killed, of whom 400 were military, which means 800 innocent people were killed. Over 250 were then kidnapped, including Holocaust survivors who were grandparents and babies. Do you accept that that happened?
Well, the people were kidnapped.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Do you accept that Holocaust survivors and babies were kidnapped?
I don't know about that.
Why don't
Oh,
you?
yeah, I did. I saw one released. In the first set of release, there was somebody who was a Holocaust
Why are you not
survivor.
curious to read about that, though?
Well, I did. I did read about it.
I mean, we made a big thing of reading,
There
reading.
were a number of old people and young people who were released, I don't know, sometime in November.
The baby's never been released.
I beg your pardon.
The baby was never released. The baby was kidnapped and never been released.
Well, you know, Piers, you may or may not just be making it up. I know.
Making it up?
Babe, Piers, I know you believe nonsense that you're told by Zaka and other.
All right. Yeah.
made up stuff.
Just to clarify, if anybody happened to come across this show but only gets their news from Roger Waters, yeah, Kfir Bibas has been in captivity. Last week was the moment where he's now spent more time as a Hamas hostage than not as a Hamas hostage. He was taken when he was 9 months old, or just before he turned 9 months old. But yeah, but Roger Waters sits there, and this is not, you know, when there's over 200 hostages, you don't know all the names, you don't know all the stories. This is one of the more famous stories. You don't have to spend a lot of time looking into the news from sources other than Al Jazeera and Electronic Intifada to know the story of Kfir Bibas. But Roger Waters really is sitting there saying, you know, this maybe is something you're making up right now. And then, of course, he has a whole rant about Zaka, which I don't know if we're going to play, but we are going a bit over time with today's show. Morgan, your thoughts on that last clip?
Just to say again that he stresses how informed he is and how well read he is, and yet how could he not know about the hostage who is a baby? I can't recall their name, but you said it just there, because that baby has been the face of the hostages, along with figures like Noah Agamani. And you know, it's a huge symbol of the hostages who were taken because he's a baby, and it's just truly awful. And so either Roger Waters really is just consuming his information from a very particular sources, or again is just denying something out of hand because it's too inconvenient for him to acknowledge. Because in his mind, this isn't just Hamas, this is, I think he called it earlier, the Palestinian Liberation Movement or something, who are engaging in armed resistance, legitimate resistance. And how can you square that with the fact that they stole a baby as a hostage? And you can't. And so either he's just truly ignorant on something he claims to be informed about, or he really has to lie to himself.
Kirk.
Yeah, a lot of the pot calling the kettle black with the way he accuses peers of saying just listening to the sources he wants to listen to, and then like his big go-to is a documentary from Al Jazeera, which I know, as you Razi alluded to earlier, is funded by the government of Qatar, which currently sponsors and hosts the leaders of Hamas within its own country. So that's Al Jazeera for you. Not to mention, from what I know about Al Jazeera, they're like a billion times worse when you read them in Arabic.
Yeah. Yeah, and look, having Kfir Bibas as a symbol because he was the youngest, because he's the baby, and it shows what type of savages the Palestinian people are. Again, it's important to say, it's important for me to say in this context, the Palestinian people, because it may have been Hamas operatives who went there. It may have not been. We don't actually know who exactly did what, because it was not just Hamas operatives. It was not just the people who were preparing and training for October 7th. It was other Palestinians who heard that the fence is down, who went in to take part. But we do know that hostages are held by families, moved around by families. again, you know, getting the hostages out is something that decent Palestinians could make happen, and they choose not to, including in the case of a baby. And there was a comment here. I think it was, yeah. Susie says, "I do not believe that baby is still alive, unfortunately." Well, we don't know that one way or another. Of course, it's we know that many of the hostages are dead. We don't know how many. We know in some cases who they are, but what we know is that way too many of the people involved and in October 7th, the people involved in holding the hostages, way too many of them are still alive and at large. So let's hope that does not remain the case for much longer. We have one more clip, so let's go to that clip.
You've been accused of anti-Semitism by a lot of people.
Yeah.
But in February 2023, Polly Sampson, the former lyricist for Pink Floyd and the wife of Dave Gilmour from Pink Floyd, tweeted this: "Sadly, Roger Waters, you are anti-Semitic to your rotten core, also a Putin apologist and a lying, thieving, hypocritical, tax-avoiding, lip-syncing, misogynistic, sick with envy, megalomaniac. Enough of your nonsense." A few hours later, David Gilmour retweeted this and commented, "Every word demonstrably true."
No comment.
You have no comment to that?
Oh, shut up. Please.
Really? No comment?
It's private.
It's not private, it's public on Twitter.
I'm sorry. Well,
Relax now.
she's public. I'm private, all right? I'm private about that.
But these are people you've worked with in one of the biggest bands in the world.
Oh, I've gone. There I am. No. Come
Morgan, this was your clip.
Well, I think it's just interesting that people who really know him are coming away with that opinion as well. So, there will be people again, and Roger Waters has said this, that he's not an anti-Semite, he's just anti-Zionist. And yet it's revealing that people who spent an awful lot of time with him, his bandmate and his bandmate's wife, who was the lyricist, Piers Morgan is saying as well, for Pink Floyd, know all this stuff about him. And you would have to think they would be inclined to be favorable towards him if he was really a great guy behind the scenes, who really was just concerned about human rights and being against genocide, as he opines throughout this whole interview. And so I think that should be notable to people, that this is coming from not just from random people on the internet, this is coming from people who know him. And as I said before, Roger Waters is clearly a despicable figure, but the real point of this and the point of focusing on him is that this isn't just an opinion that's limited to him. If everyone else in the world didn't think like him and he was the only one who espoused this opinion, it would be disgusting, but it wouldn't mean very much. And yet there's an awful lot of people who come to the point of view that Roger Waters is espousing here and have this kind of mainstream credibility, and when really they should be on the freak fringes of the world.
Kirk.
I thought Morgan summed it up nicely there.
Yeah, the no comment part is interesting. It's these are not light accusations, but of course, Morgan, you said, these are people who know him, and they know him personally and they know him well, but unfortunately we know him because he speaks publicly, and he speaks publicly and is listened to because of his achievements as a musician, rather than his achievements as a thinker. And so that's a whole other issue of to what extent we should listen to people who have achieved something in one area when they talk about another area, and to the extent that we should, because the fact that you have these achievements means maybe there's more there. We also need to know when to cut them off and when to say, you know what, this person has shown us who he is, what a despicable lowlife he is. And I think Roger Waters has shown us many times, and it was put together very well in this 1 hour and 10-minute interview. I've said in the past that you cannot be a decent human being and support the Palestinians at the same time. But as far as indecent human beings, there are still levels, and Roger Waters, I think, unlocked a new level. Thanks guys. Thanks everybody for watching. Kirk, where can people find more from you?
On Twitter at Kirk Wilcox, and on YouTube at Kirk Wilcox. And I also want to shout out Mary Bachman. Last week sent me $100, but it was meant for the Ayn Rand Center UK. She said she didn't know of your PayPal, so she sent it to me, and I forwarded it to you guys. So I wanted to give her a shout out today. Sent that for my birthday, but this week is America's birthday, so feel free to support the Ayn Rand Center UK for America's birthday this week.
Yeah, and we did mention Mary's super chat yesterday or the day before, but $100 super chat I think merits several mentions. Morgan, where can people find more from you?
You can find me on Twitter at Morgan Carter 98, where certainly tomorrow I'm going to be tweeting about the death knell of our country, as well as maybe giving out some tweets celebrating the birthday of America. Unfortunately, these two things fall on the same day. But you can find me on Twitter, Morgan Carter 98.
Well, I'm Razi Ginzberg on X. I will also be tweeting about the election tomorrow night. Yeah, we were thinking about doing an all-nighter. I think that's probably not going to happen. Maybe we'll do that for the U.S. election. That's kind of difficult logistically, but yeah. And of course, we will continue to cover the war, and we will continue to cover the U.S. election. I think things are moving there. As I said, I think I said this in the day after the debate. I don't believe Biden will be the nominee. Now it seems likely that he's not going to be the nominee. So we will be covering that to the extent necessary. Thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you back here tomorrow.